One of my favorite experiences is, and I don't know if you've ever had it, if you're with a small person on a plane and you take off on a particularly gloomy day, and then you punch eventually through the clouds. And if you're on the plane to Stornoway, you don't go much above the clouds, but you do go through them just, and it's usually pretty bumpy. But you get through them, and then you see that the weather is quite relative, because above them, a child will often say, "Oh, it's always a nice day when you're up above the clouds." And I think that's one of the most helpful ways to think about a relationship between faith and the reality of God's goodness and how we need to exercise it in the world. Because very often, just like the sun is always there shining up above the clouds, and it's always a good day up there, it doesn't often feel like that, particularly in the west coast of Scotland. It's heavily obscured. And the events and circumstances of our lives can heavily obscure our belief and our trust and even our awareness of God's innate goodness and his eternal generosity to us. And what the Psalms are really good for, and when we interpret them rightly, what they help us do is give us a paradigm for how to punch up above the clouds, because they're very real about the fact that we start very much under a canopy of cloud cover for a lot of our lives. So this psalm, like a lot of the others, is we don't actually know the context. We know it's probably comes from one of the harder points in David's life where he's struggling, but we don't really have any other particulars we can hang it on to, and that's very deliberate in the Psalms. A lot of the Psalms are what you'd call acontextual. You know, so much of when I get up here, I can say, right, we think this is about 1000 BC, and that means that in world history this was going on, and the Psalms very rarely allow you to do that. But the purpose of that means that you and I can readily relate to it without needing much context, because the themes in it are human and universal, and the continued struggle to find and see God amidst all the ups and downs, and particularly the downs of life, is very much what they're about. So this morning, I want to look at, as we've been thinking about God's generosity, which is, you know, absolutely part of who he is in and of himself, and I hope I've demonstrated that in the last 2 weeks. I want to look at what interrupts our faith in that generosity often. And then secondly, how God restores our faith in his generosity. And thirdly, then how we can respond in the future. So, how our belief in God's generosity is often interrupted. Let's look at where the psalmist starts, because he doesn't start in a very good place. I have a message in my heart concerning the sinfulness of the wicked. There's no fear of God before their eyes. They flatter themselves too much to detect or hate sin. The words of their mouth are wicked, and on their beds they plot evil. So there's a kind of broad sketch of somebody that the psalmist is observing and looking at, and for some reason they're on his radar. And here's some of the characteristics. I mean, why would you start a psalm in a holy book like the Bible focusing on someone that is really, you think is missing the mark? And that'll become apparent. But let's look at what they actually say in this anatomy of the person. Let's look first at their thought life. In their own eyes, or in their perception of themselves, they flatter themselves too much to detect or hate their sin. Now, I want to try and connect this and make it universal for us and relatable as much as possible. The psalmist, for some reason, has locked eyes on someone, and they've noticed that within their inner world and thought life, they justify absolutely everything about their behavior. As we see, their behavior is not good, is not upright or moral in any way, but they continue to make an argument for that. They continue, if you like, they flatter themselves too much to detect their sin. So what they do is they stand and they have the approach and attitude that's very poor towards others, but they erect a fortress around themselves of defenses and hedges and protection so that nobody's going to be able to penetrate it and come in and give any correction. I think this is pretty relatable for a lot of us, because he's talking about human beings, and in many, many ways they have not changed much since the days of the psalmist, whenever that was, to today. Because it's difficult as a human being to be vulnerable. It can be hard to take our defenses down, and we all build them. And taking criticism and critical reflection is one of the absolute hardest things to do as a human being. But those that do it and are able to do it are kind of separate themselves, because they're usually continually growing. And it's a particular function of growing spiritually. It's, in a nutshell, what the Bible calls humility. And it's something that's often in short supply, and it could make a huge difference to our world. But anyway, this is the way this person conceives of themselves. They continue to convince themselves that they're fine, and the problem must be out there and somewhere elsewhere. That's their kind of thoughts. And then their words of their mouths are wicked and deceitful. So the other problem is, it's not just that they have an inflated sense of themselves, but then whatever they say, you can't take it to the bank. There's always an agenda. What they're hoping to do is to try and deceive others, almost certainly in a way that benefits themselves. So it's in other places in Proverbs, in the sense, what's called basically a slippery person. You can never really nail them down to anything they say, and they won't let you take them at their word. Or if you try to do it, then they'll change it and they'll say, no, that's not really what I said. Really, really difficult person. And then their actions, on their beds, they are plotting evil, and then they commit themselves to a sinful course. So this is somebody who is hell-bent on causing destruction wherever they go. They're not looking to build anything up or be terribly productive. They are looking to flatter and absorb themselves in their own world, and then probably just by virtue of doing that are just causing trouble wherever they go, and certainly causing destruction in the lives of others. Now, this psalm is not just a character assassination of somebody the psalmist knows. Let's look at why this matters, okay? In verse 11, and this is where it's struggling, it's interrupting the psalmist's faith in God's goodness. In verse 11, may the foot of the proud not come against me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. And when you read that verse, you go, that's why the psalmist opened with that. The psalmist is opening with a heartfelt sketch, almost like a journal entry, of what they are really struggling with in life just now. And it's somebody that is threatening them, is using their pride and their hubris and their lack of self-awareness and all of that to make ostensibly the psalmist's life a nightmare. And it's so bad that they're having to call out to God and ask for his justice to intervene in that. But this is all the psalmist at the start is able to focus on. And so many of the psalms go on this kind of wild emotional journey, and that's what's going on here. But this might be, for you and me, this might be where we are. We might be having our faith in God's goodness interrupted by what? By the reality of living in a pretty dismal, fallen world. The church should be somewhere that we can be really real about the state of the condition of the world we live in and the humanity, and somewhere we can come to really grieve that, because a lot of the other places we go in the world, there's almost an unrelenting focus on that all people are basically good, and that we don't have too many problems that we can't sort out ourselves as a human race. And this will be somewhere where we should be able to go, actually, there's something radically wrong with the human race, and we're all paying the price and the consequences for it. Some of you might be struggling with a person who fits this character bill and description, and they are making your life or the lives of others a nightmare, and you have to sit with that. And there's a real sense of injustice to it because it doesn't stop, and they do it to good people. We have people all over the world today who are living in wicked and unjust regimes because there are egotistical maniacs running the country, and what they try and do is persecute people that are not like them. So this is all very live and real, whether it's at our individual level or at the broadest possible scale. And what can we do with that if we find ourselves there? Let me just not really round that point off, because something we're terrible at in the church is giving people space to grieve and to feel the weight of often what's a disastrous world. To feel the dashed hopes and expectations, to feel the emptiness. And I wouldn't want to leave anyone there, but the Psalms aren't triumphalistic. They're so real about how difficult it can be walking through this world and dealing with the human condition and the evil that befalls us and comes our way so often. And you know what? It's okay to feel that. Even if you believe in God, are starting to believe in God, or have believed in God your whole life, the psalmist and the Psalms give you permission to feel the weight and the grief of that experience of life, and even wondering where God is amongst it. And it can interrupt our faith in God's goodness and generosity to us. And then from verse 5, there's a kind of restoration, because the psalmist goes to really a confession of faith. Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens. Your faithfulness, or a perfectly accurate translation of that would be your truthfulness reaches to the skies, and your justice is like the great deep. So I want to do what I did with the person that the psalmist is focused on, and now I want to do with the same thing with Yahweh, his God, and what God looks like to him by contrast. What are God's thoughts? What are God's intentions? What is God like in himself, and how does that radiate out? Well, he says, verse 5, your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens. The word in the Hebrew for love there is possibly my favorite word in the whole Bible, because I say this so many times, but love has become such a pedestrian word for us. But the Hebrew chesed is a rich and a potent word. It's one of these ones that there isn't just one good English word for it. It's so hard to translate, but that's because of its beauty, depth, richness, and complexity. So chesed would bring in ideas of not just love, but of faith, enduring faithfulness, of covenant faithfulness, of a God who has bonded and binded himself to people and continues to demonstrate that, an unrelenting love that doesn't ever let go or give up on the object of its love. So chesed says all of that. And really what the psalmist is starting to meditate on is, I'm speaking to the God who has bonded himself to me and my people. I'm speaking to the God whose thoughts and intentions towards us, he's let us know, are good and are pure and are for our good and wants us to benefit and to be built up. And then your truthfulness reaches to the skies. Now, this is a wonderful bit of poetry, because what he does is he says, and then when I think of what my God is like in terms of his speech, what he says and what he reveals, well, he cannot lie. Everything he says is perfectly true and good. God is the God I'm worshipping is the fountain of all truth. If anything is true, it is because God has kind of let us know about it, and it exists because he's the kind of bedrock of all truth and truthfulness. There's no deceit in him. He's never trying to trick me. He's never trying to get something past me. And the psalmist is just meditating on those qualities and going, how different is God from everyone I know, and particularly my enemies who are giving me a hard time. Your justice is like the great deep, or your judgments, the things, when you weigh up what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong, those decisions, those estimations that you make of what is right and good and true are so deep that they rival the deepest waters that we know of. Now, in that little bit of poem, what he's done is he's gone, God's truthfulness reaches, it's immeasurably up in the skies. It's up above the clouds. And God's, what he makes decisions on, how he comes to his decisions, are so deep. Now, in the ancient world, for the psalmist, the deep was a scary place. The deep was where sea monsters and various rival gods and powers lived that could challenge the authority of any god, including Israel's. And he's saying, actually, that's where God's justice is. It's there, and it's unchallengeable. It's unfathomable. And by thinking of the highest heights and the deepest depths. He's saying, this actually all belongs to God. Everything from all the way up there to all the way down here and everything in between, it's all encompassed by the character and the nature of God. And he then kind of starts to get quite practical and go, well, what does God do with that? The fact that he has this unbreakable love towards people that he shows, the fact that he has just nothing but truthful words with no deceit in them, the fact that he acts justly on behalf of people. What does he do with that? He thinks, how priceless is this love of yours, O God? People are brought in to take refuge in the shadow of your wings, to feast in the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from your river of delights. Basically, the way we can apply this is all of these attributes of God, what God does with them for you and me is he gives them away. Or putting it another way, God gives of himself. And that's what the psalmist finds as restoring his faith in God's generosity, because he remembers God doesn't just ask us to worship him from afar off just because he is good and loving and truthful. He says, come and actually experience that. I'll give that away to you. I'll let you taste of it and experience it. The wee image of the river and drinking of the river of delights, they would have understood that to be, in ancient cosmologies, the rivers flowed out of the temple of the God who created all things. And so he was seeing that this God invites people in to where his sacred space is, his temple, to be able to come and sample his goodness. He gives away his generosity and his love. He isn't loving and asks us to remember that or know that from afar. He asks us to taste and experience that. And nowhere is that more true than for us as Christians. Because I love the way Jesus comes and he sort of puts a capstone on all the things that have already been revealed about God in the Old Testament and in the Psalms. Because when Jesus comes, he gives away everything that he is and that he has on behalf of his people. Or as the great hymn in Philippians 2 says, he didn't consider equality with God anything to be grasped at, but he came and took the form of a servant. What does a servant do? They run around after other people. So this God who, and I know I'm using the New Testament a bit here, but I think it's consistent. This God who has unfathomable love, truthfulness, goodness, and justice comes in the form of Jesus as God and man and says, I'm giving all of that to you. You can come and know what it is to be close with God. And that experience is open to every single one of us through relationship with Jesus because of what we'll be thinking about on Holy Week. He comes to give that away. And so many human beings, so many that we'll meet, will want to take. They want to extract whatever worth they can from us. They want to weight us down. They want to attack us. They want to destroy good things in our lives or in the lives of others. And if you take nothing else from today, take this picture that the psalmist gives, that everything that we mourn that is terrible about human condition and humans, God is the opposite of that. God is good, loving, truthful, and gives himself away and spends himself on behalf of others rather than taking from them. And that's what restores the psalmist's faith and generosity after it's been so cruelly interrupted. And then, so how does he respond to that, and how can we respond to God's generosity? Continue your love, he says in verse 10, to those who know you, your righteousness to the upright in heart. And may the foot of the proud not come against me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. So here's what I want to leave this morning, because the psalmist ends with having realized all of this, having been down in the depths himself, and having had a vision of God's love and goodness that's lifted him back up. Here's a prayer of faith and resolve that he's making to take himself forward and to hopefully continue believing in the generosity of God towards him. He's saying, God, can you continue to preserve me? Can you continue to keep me? Because I want to stay in this place where I realize that you are there. He's acknowledging the fact that there's a threat that he'll come back down with and have this clouded view again because of the evil and everything around him. And here's what's applicable about that is our highest points of joy, our greatest experiences of sensing and knowing God's presence, whether that's in church or however else we connect with God, these two will pass. And there will be other days where things will come in and they'll threaten to obscure and shroud that view of God's goodness. And the key is with the psalmist to ask for God in the future to pray, to do things, to remind us of his goodness, even in those times. But also, and this is something I don't think we maybe say enough, it's okay to pray to God and ask him to change the circumstances. It's okay to ask God to act in accordance with his justice. May the foot of the proud not come against me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. I'm going to say something similar to point one, where the psalmist gives us permission, and it's okay to ask for God to bring an end to whatever wickedness and suffering other folks are causing. Because if we are struggling under the experience of that, and we know it is unjust and evil, then if we know that, then God knows that infinitely more. And he is a God of justice. And it's okay to feel like everything is a bit too much and to ask God for a bit of relief in that, in one way or the other. And I don't know how God will answer these prayers, and I'm not here to guarantee that. And also, the psalmist isn't even there to guarantee that. What he's inviting you to do is to do what he's done and continue the journey of faith for another day. And put your stock and your faith and your trust in that God who, when we see above the clouds what he's really like, is pure love and goodness. And so what does that look like for you? Maybe it is to pray for a change in circumstances, but maybe it is to exercise a bit of faith and to consider what that would look like for you, to believe that God is going to be as good as he is in the middle of the psalm, and that goodness will be with you in whatever you step out into next. Maybe that's taking a risk, whether it's giving part of yourself away. What do we have? We have our time, our talents, our energy, our resources. Maybe it's doing something new. Maybe it's giving up something old. There are so many things that can cause us apprehension, and we'll wonder, is God going to be there in the future with us as we do that? And it is okay to do it with a slight sense of trepidation, going, I don't know if God will be there, because the psalmist doesn't towards the end, but ultimately somewhere believing that he will, because he's shown us his goodness, he's given us a glimpse of it, his perfect love, which pierces the clouds. And he does ultimately promise that for his own, he will never leave them or forsake them. And all he's looking for us is to respond and place a bit of actual faith in that fact. Maybe it's taking a greater commitment towards actually following Jesus, whatever that looks like. Church involvement, membership, coming and being part of ministry, inquiring and exploring about something you were too scared to ask about. Because I promise you, whatever it is and whatever the Holy Spirit puts on your heart, he will be there with you. And the encouragement of the psalm is, he is there with you, even though you feel like he might be totally obscured. Because there are many things, as the psalmist found, that will come and interrupt our sense of God's being present and there and being good and generous towards us. But in the journey of faith, he always restores that. And then he calls us to respond, believing that it'll continue. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.